guys, and welcome back to Dark Matter Podcast. I'm Dominique.
And I'm Avalon.
And today we're going to be talking about one of the most mysterious areas in the globe, the Bermuda Triangle. And I'm super excited because I've been interested in this ever since I did a project on it in the 3rd grade. So let's just get right into it.
Perfect. Okay, so first, just to give an explanation of what the Bermuda Triangle actually is, because I'm sure we've all heard of it, but there's actually, there's specifics to it. So first of all, it's a space over the North Atlantic Ocean, and one corner of the triangle is in Florida, one is in Bermuda, hence the name, and the other is in the Greater Antilles. So if you're like me and you've never heard of the Greater Antilles, here's a little information on them. I just thought it would be something interesting to include rather than just jumping into all of the conspiracies and everything. I thought it'd be good to give it a little bit of cultural context and just location as well. So Greater Antilles are a group of islands that make up 90% of the West Indies, or nearly 90%. And the islands included are Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Jamaica. And again, if you didn't know, like I didn't, Hispaniola is the island that contains Dominican Republic and Haiti. So it's an island with 2 nations on it. And so something crazy that we just learned about the Bermuda Triangle is that it is between 500,000 and 1,510,000 square miles. So obviously there's not an exact
measurement, yeah.
There's not not an exact measurement. We don't know exactly where it starts and where it ends. But that's huge. That's absolutely massive. However, it does not appear on any maps. So if you look on any world map, it's not going to be labeled. And the U.S. Board of Geographic Names does not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as an official region in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's something like I was saying earlier, it's kind of something like SoCal, like Southern California. We all know what that is, but it's not necessarily labeled on a map. So I feel like it's kind of like that, where it's a huge, huge, expansive part of our ocean, or of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's not actually labeled. So in a way, it doesn't really exist. It's just kind of like something we refer to, and we all know what it means.
Yeah, but I feel everyone really knows about it. I don't think there's a lot of people in the world who haven't heard of the Bermuda Triangle. So even though I don't think it's official, I feel like everyone recognizes it, or the area that it's supposed to be in, at least.
Exactly. That's what made me laugh about it, because we all know the Bermuda Triangle, so it made me laugh that it's not even labeled, it's not even recognized as a place. So I thought that was crazy. I just thought that would be interesting to mention. And so the Bermuda Triangle has many different nicknames. One of them is the Devil's Triangle, the Hurricane Alley, Limbo of the Lost, and the Hoodoo Sea. So these are just different names people call them. Obviously, not great things happen in the Bermuda Triangle if we look at those names. And I'm assuming that the Hoodoo Sea name comes from somewhere near Haiti, because I know that there's hoodoo and voodoo that that's a part of Haitian culture. So I don't know if maybe that's where that name comes from. I don't really know. But I thought that was really interesting to include. And so something else we know about the Bermuda Triangle is that between roughly 50 ships and 20 planes have disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. But we don't know how many it really is, because that's just an estimate. Those are the ones that we actually know disappeared there. But there could be many more that disappeared in this region. So we don't really know. And another thing that we wanted to mention is that the Bermuda Triangle is over the water. Or how do I describe this? So the Bermuda Triangle is just the area of water, but underneath the area is the Puerto Rico Trench, which is over 27,000 feet deep. And for context, that's 5 miles, over 5 miles down. And then just for comparison, we thought we would include the height of the world's tallest building. It's the Burj Khalifa. And I think that's in Abu Dhabi, right?
Yeah, I believe so, in Dubai.
Yeah, and the Burj Khalifa is just over 2,700 feet tall, which is about half a mile. So if you think about the tallest building in the world is half a mile, this is pretty much 10 times that down. So that's just crazy to think about. I just feel like it adds to the mystery and creepiness of the Bermuda Triangle that it's this area of ocean that, first of all, is so expansive, and it's so expansive down as well. It's not just a big plot of land. It also is really, really deep. So who knows what goes down, or what goes on down there.
I was really surprised actually when we found the actual numbers for the surface area and just how deep down it goes, because I don't think I fully realized just how large the actual surface area was, as well as how deep. So that is a large amount of area for ships and planes to get lost in.
Yeah, it's hard to even comprehend that for us. It's just it's a huge amount of land or a huge amount of ocean. And I think that
Hmm.
just the oceans in general are so mysterious. We've talked about it before that we love like maritime mysteries and there's just something about it that intrigues us and I feel like intrigues everyone because the ocean is just so mysterious. So this is just an especially mysterious little plot of the ocean.
Yeah, especially seeing as how we've only explored about 5% of the oceans, actually. So, I mean, we don't even know what's down there, like most of what's down there. So, I think that that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Something else we wanted to mention was a common myth about the Bermuda Triangle before we get into anything that happened there. One thing people say a lot, like this is like a myth that will get circulated, is that um, pilots avoid the Bermuda Triangle. So people will say, oh, I know that pilots don't go over the Bermuda Triangle because they don't want to, they don't want to get lost or whatever. This is simply not true, you guys. So there are plenty of flights from Miami to Puerto Rico or any other combination of areas that cross through the Bermuda that actually have to cross through this area to get from one place to the other. There's really no way around it, and this happens on a daily basis. So if that was true, that pilots didn't go over the Bermuda Triangle, basically you wouldn't be able to go to Puerto Rico from Miami, or you wouldn't be able to go on all these places that people go all the time. So that is just a myth. We just wanted to say that before, yeah, before we got into it.
Yeah, so now let's get into the history and the famous occurrences that happened in the Bermuda Triangle. And I think it's fair to say that the most famous one would be the disappearance of Flight 19. So, Flight 19 started off as a routine training flight, and on December 5th, 1945, five TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from a naval air station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And Flight 19 was scheduled to perform a 3 hour exercise called Navigation Problem 1. They were scheduled to fly in a triangular flight pattern where they were first supposed to head east from the Florida coast to conduct bombings and runs at a place called Hens and Chicken Shoals. They would then proceed north and head to Grand Bahama Island before flying southwest back to base. Except for one of the planes, the rest of the Avengers were crewed by three Navy men or Marines, most of whom who had logged about 300 hours in the air. So they were no rookies. They had a lot of time in the air and they were pretty experienced. And the flight's leader was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, who is a pilot and veteran of several combat missions in World War II, specific theater. And at first, Flight 19 proceeded as normal, and Taylor and his pilots flew over Hens and Chicken Shoals and dropped their practice bombs around 2:30 p.m. However, when the flight returned north for the rest of its journey is when things kind of started to take a strange turn. Taylor suddenly became convinced that his compass was malfunctioning and that they had been flying in the wrong direction. And troubles only increased when a front brought on rain, gusting winds, and heavy cloud cover, which only added to the pilot's confusion. And another Navy flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, was the first person to hear the patrol's radio communications and contact the Avengers to ask if they needed assistance. Taylor radioed back that both his compasses were out and that he was trying to find Fort Lauderdale, and he also stated that he could see land and he believed that he was somewhere over the Keys. But his claim didn't really make any sense because he had just made a scheduled drop over Hens and Chicken Shoals in the Bahamas less than an hour earlier. But he was now claiming that he believed he was somewhere in the Florida Keys, which was over 100 miles off course. Though apparently Taylor had just transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Miami, and a lot of people later speculated that he may have just been confused on some of the islands in the Bahamas for the Keys. So he wasn't really over the Keys, he might have just been in the Bahamas and he was confused. So normally if a pilot gets lost in the Atlantic City, or in the Atlantic, they're supposed to point their planes toward the sun and fly towards the mainland, but Taylor became convinced that he might be over the Gulf of Mexico, and so he made the decision to steer Flight 19 northeast, and that was a decision that would take them even farther out to sea. And it was at this point that some of his pilots realized that he seemed to be making a mistake, and Taylor was convinced to turn around and head west. However, shortly after, and this is like the reasons for why he did this are unknown, but he suddenly called off the order and he once again changed direction. So it's believed at this point that one of the planes broke off from the others and headed in a different direction, but most followed their commander's lead. And as they continued out to sea, Flight 19's radio transmissions became increasingly faint and they began to run low on fuel. And a few minutes later, Flight 19's last radio transmission was replaced with a buzz of static.
Right, and so the Navy immediately dispatched search planes for the missing crew, and at 7:30 p.m., a pair of PBM Mariner flying boats took off from an air station north of Fort Lauderdale. But just 20 minutes later, one of the planes suddenly vanished off radar, and to this day, the remains of the Mariner and the 13 crewmen on the Mariner have never been found. It's widely believed that the seaplane exploded shortly after takeoff, which is wild to think about. And the next day, the Navy sent out over 300 boats and aircrafts to search for the missing Flight 19 and the Mariner. They spent 5 days and they covered more than 300,000 square miles, but they found absolutely nothing. They found no bodies, no debris, nothing. And they just seemed to have vanished, and the Navy attributed the loss to causes or reasons unknown.
That's crazy to me that how many, like 6 planes and 2 PB Mariners suddenly just disappeared and they didn't find anything. I would assume that with as many planes as there were, there would be at least a little bit of debris.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, because obviously I don't know much about like what happens when a plane goes down, especially if it goes down in the ocean. But it seems that, yeah, like you said, like there were so many of them that went missing that you think you'd find something would float to the surface, right? Like you're gonna tell me that the entire ship, everything on it, all the people, everything just sunk down and nothing came to the surface. Like, I don't know, it just seems so strange to me that just because like they sent out planes, they sent out boats, they looked over 300,000 square miles, they were bound to find something over 5 days, you know. But the fact that they found absolutely nothing floating around or just no sign of anything happening is very strange, and I think that definitely adds to the mystery and the folklore of the Bermuda Triangle, because you know these kind of events are so crazy because it's like, well, where did they go? What happened to them? I mean, yeah, they could have just sunk and like that was the end of it, but like really, there's nothing left behind. It's just so strange.
Yeah, it really is. And another famous disappearance on the Bermuda Triangle was actually when one of the biggest ships in the US Navy at the time, the USS Cyclops, vanished in 1918. So the Cyclops was nearly 550 feet long with a crew of about 360 people. And when the US entered World War I in 1917, the USS Cyclops became a valuable naval asset and it was meant to transport troops and coal around the world. So on March 1918, the Cyclops left Brazil after being loaded up with tons of manganese that's used for steelmaking before making the journey to Barbados and heading home to Baltimore. However, at some point during the 9-day trip, the ship suddenly vanished without even sending out an SOS, and no one from the ship has ever been seen from again. And the last known communication from the Cyclops just said, "Weather fair, all well." So nothing really suspicious. There was no signal calling out for help or mayday, anything like that. So I would assume, it had to have happened suddenly or whatever happened to them, because I can't imagine, like it takes time for a ship to sink. So I would imagine they would have time to send out like some radio signal calling out for help, but they didn't even do that, which is what makes this whole thing really confusing.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was thinking as well, is that like how could it have just gone missing, a whole ship with like over 300 people on it just gone missing, and like they didn't say anything. And I'm also assuming that like if it is a ship that can hold up to 300 plus people, then it's probably going to be a
really
big
large
ship. Yeah, like obviously it's going to be big, and so like you said, it's not going to just go down in 5 minutes. Like that's going to take a while to go down. So the fact that they said nothing is just odd to me. And like, I mean, I guess my mind automatically goes to like, okay, maybe their communication system was down, but like how often does that happen? Or you know what I mean, like what is the likelihood that during that entire time that it was sinking there was no way for them to contact anyone? It just seems very odd to me, and I don't get it. It's another, like I said, it's just like another one of those mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle that like, how did this happen?
And especially since, like we mentioned before, there were about 300 people on board, but there were never any survivors found or anything like that. It literally vanished without a trace, like they just disappeared into thin air.
Yeah, and I think that one thing to mention also is that, like, as we mentioned earlier, the Bermuda Triangle is a huge plot of ocean. So it's between 500,000 and 1,500,000 square miles. So obviously that's like more land, or more space than most of us can even comprehend.
Right.
So I understand that like if they did start sinking, there was really nowhere for them to go. But it's just like too many weird things. You know what I mean? The fact that like it went down, there was 300 people, and like you said, none of them even like washed up or anything. I don't know how far they were from shore, but like, it just seems so odd to me that like just they just vanished without a trace, and nobody's
Right.
ever found them since. It just doesn't sit right with me. So I feel like that, yeah, it's just unexplained. So next we want to get into the theories. We're going to call them theories instead of conspiracy theories, even though some of them definitely are conspiracy theories. And we
Oh
did want to
yeah.
mention before we actually talk about the theories themselves that we don't want to go into this with the mindset of like these are facts and this is what we believe and like this and that, because I think conspiracy theories, they definitely can be harmful. They can, like in certain cases, they can lead to just negative outcomes. Like I don't know if any of you have heard of Pizzagate, but that was an example of like a conspiracy theory that actually ended in a man shooting a place up because he was convinced that it was harboring all these horrible things. Turns out they weren't harboring any of those things, and he didn't kill anyone, but he very well could have. And I just think that conspiracy theories can be very negative, and they can kind of just lead you into this mindset where you're like not seeing things the way they are. So we don't want to be those kind of we don't want to be like that. We don't want to be necessarily like encouraging conspiracy theories, but we just want to consider all the different things that could be going on and the theories that people have, and just like have an open mind, but also not be so have like a conviction of like this is what happened.
Right, and I think it's also interesting to mention that, again, these are just theories. Like, these are the ideas that people have come up with to explain these disappearances, whether or not we actually believe in them, like, these are just things that people have said, and obviously, we don't know the answers. That's the thing. It's like, it's one of the big mysteries is the Bermuda Triangle, and obviously, we're not going to solve that today. I mean, I would love to, but I don't think we're that smart. I don't think we're suddenly going to find the answers here today, but like I said, I think it's definitely interesting to think about the different theories and conspiracies, whether they are believable or not, because these are ones that have been thrown around for many years.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the first one we want to get into, we wanted to go from like the more realistic and probable ones into, or maybe not probable, like, but just the ones that are easiest to get your mind around to the crazier ones. So the first one we wanted to mention was environmental factors. So there's a lot of tropical storms that happen in the Bermuda Triangle, as well as hurricanes, and just the Atlantic at large. It is called the Hurricane Alley, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. So obviously there's lots of storms that happen there that could attribute, or could be, the reason for why so many planes and ships go down. And there's the Gulf Stream, which is an intense ocean current in the west North Atlantic that moves north along the coast of Florida and then turns eastward off of North Carolina, flowing northeast across the Atlantic. And it can cause rapid and sometimes violent changes in weather, which might explain why ships will just suddenly, like that one ship that said, oh, everything's fine, the weather's good, and then all of a sudden they just went missing. That might explain it. I still don't think that's like enough to explain that example, but that does make sense that it would be like the perfect, no pun intended, the perfect storm for people to, for their ship to go missing or their plane to go missing if it seems like it's perfectly fine weather, and then because of this current, just randomly there's like violent changes in the weather that maybe you couldn't even predict. So that one does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, like, it's interesting to note, like we said, there is, like, very sudden changes, so it could amount for that. And also, again, considering the fact that it is such a large surface area of water, such a large body of water, like, it is possible, I guess, to think about how a sudden storm could suddenly take down a ship. But, I mean, I also kind of wonder about the planes, though, like, I understand, like, sudden storms and hurricanes and stuff like that, but I don't know, it just seems confusing to me, like, especially considering, like, the Flight 19 thing. They didn't seem to recall there were no messages sent out saying that there was a hurricane approaching or any tropical storm. I would feel like they would be able to tell quick enough to send out a message.
That's true. That like yeah, because I was thinking of that too. Like, what about the planes? And I was like, oh yeah, well like hurricanes, of course, are going to affect
Mm-hmm.
planes. But I guess that's a good point. That like if there was a violent weather change, as far as like if you were in the ocean, yeah, that would affect you no matter what. But if there was like a weather change and it wasn't like a hurricane or anything, it was just like the seas were really like blustery. I mean, I guess the wind would affect the planes. I guess it would affect it no matter what. But yeah, it's just like I feel like that's something to take into consideration, but it's not enough to explain the mysterious
Right.
disappearances. Yeah, and one thing I don't think we mentioned this earlier. I forgot to mention this. Um, if you look up the Bermuda Triangle, you'll find this several places. The Bermuda Triangle does not have more, how do I put this? So like the number of accidents that happen in the Bermuda Triangle are not proportionally higher than
Mm-hmm.
anywhere
That's
else.
true.
There is there's crazy things that happen there, of course. And I mean, we already talked about them today. That there's mysterious things that happen there, but the things that happen, the amount of things that happen in the Bermuda Triangle are actually not proportionally higher than anywhere else in the ocean. So that's just something to consider because I definitely went into this thinking, oh, well, there has to be like a ridiculous amount that have happened in the Bermuda Triangle, like especially in the Bermuda Triangle. But actually, it turns out no, like these things happen all over the ocean. I think we've just all kind of latched on to the Bermuda Triangle as a society as like this is like the place where things
Mm-hmm.
happen because there's a few really crazy ones that happen to have occurred there, but it doesn't mean that there's a proportionally a bigger chance that something's going to happen there. So that's something to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, that's one of the pieces of information that surprised me because, like I said before we had started researching this, I don't think I realized just how vast the amount of like the area was that was included in the Bermuda Triangle. So yeah, like that's why I thought, like again, there are very famous disappearances like Flight 19 and the USS Cyclops, but I guess like you said, compared to the rest of the world, it isn't more or less likely to happen, which I certainly thought, especially when I was a child, that it was very unusual that all these accidents happened in one place. But again, considering the large surface area, it really isn't.
Yeah, exactly. I think we learned a lot from this episode when we were researching that, like, first of all, yeah, I didn't know how huge it really is, but I
Mm-hmm.
also didn't know, yeah, that like the number of things that have happened at the Bermuda Triangle is actually not like it's not significant if you look at it like statistically. So, yeah, that's something to consider as well. And for our next theory that we wanted to mention is methane gas. So this one was really interesting because it sounds like oh, it's something that's like scientific and it sounds very probable. But this is actually one that's pretty much been shown to be completely false. So this really shocked me. So basically, what the theory is that, or well, this isn't a theory. It actually does happen, but the theory is that it accounts for like why all these ships and or why all the ships go missing. So it's an occurrence called I love this name. We have talked about this before. I think it's so funny. It's an occurrence known as oceanic flatulence, where methane gas erupts from the ocean sediments. I just think it's so funny that it's literally the ocean farting. I don't know. I guess I'm a 10-year-old, but like I just think that's so funny. But yeah, so methane gas I guess will come up from somewhere on the ocean floor and it floats up and what the theory is that these bubbles that are coming up kind of pop when they get to the surface and then make the water around the ship cave in and like swallow it in basically. That's the theory. And so I was like, yeah, that sounds scientific. That definitely sounds like that's an explanation. But then I looked into it. There's actually a bubble physicist, you guys. A bubble physicist. I love that. And her name is Helen. I'm not going to be able to pronounce her last name, so I'm not even going to try because
Zersky, I think.
it might
Helen
be. It
Zersky.
might be. But I'm going to refer to her as Helen. So she's a bubble physicist, and she said that there's basically no way for methane bubbles to sink ships because, so the way I was visualizing it was like this big bubble of methane will rise to the surface, and then that's why when it gets to the top and pops, it just takes the ship down with it, right? Because it's a huge bubble. But basically, what she was saying, which totally makes sense, is that that doesn't happen because when a big bubble comes out of the ocean floor, it immediately separates into many smaller bubbles because of the force pushing down on them. They can't just remain this huge bubble just floating through the ocean with all this force on them. So they become many smaller bubbles as they're releasing. And then what happens also is like, when she explained it, I was like, duh, like that makes so much more sense. I don't know why I never even thought of it. Like I watched a video on her explaining it and I was like, yeah, I don't know why I even thought this was a thing. So basically, she was explaining that like the bubbles come from the bottom, they float up, and then once they get to the surface, what they'll do is push up because obviously they're gas, they're coming out of the ocean. So they're going to push up on the boat, not pull it down. And if anything, she said that basically like if they could move the boat at all, what they would do is like their force of pushing up would be so strong that it would kind of push the boat to the side because it would get like it would be interfering with them pushing up, but there's no way that it could sink it. And she even said that like the only possible way that these methane gas bubbles would sink a ship is if when they were coming up, they moved the ship over, like I said, and they did it with such force that the ship tipped over and fell into the sea. And she then went on to say that this wouldn't happen because there's like some kind of a mechanism in like every boat ever, basically is how she phrased it, that would make it impossible for this to happen. So once she explained it, I realized that there's actually no way that it's methane bubbles that are making the ships sink into the water. That's just not true. It's just like a myth that people kind of, no pun intended again, float around. But yeah, people say that all the time, and I always thought like, yeah, that definitely makes sense, but no, it's definitely not methane bubbles at all.
Yeah, I also found this interesting because like you, I always thought like, oh, this is like a scientific explanation for, what happens, but she practically debunked this and it isn't possible at all, which is so funny because I thought like, hey, out of all the theories, I feel like this is the most reasonable one, but it really isn't even possible.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like the Dyatlov Pass episode where I was like, you know what? The most reasonable one is literally the Yeti. This is like not the same at all. Like I actually thought this was like a plausible scientific explanation,
Mm-hmm.
but Helen schooled me. It's
Yeah.
definitely not methane bubbles. Okay, so next we want to get into the far out theories, if you will.
The more
Again,
fun
we're not
ones.
the fun ones. We're not endorsing these. It's just kind of fun to speculate and just to think about. So obviously, if when all else fails, it's aliens, right? It's
Of
always
course.
aliens. So yeah, so people say that the ships and planes are abducted from the Bermuda Triangle, and the only little tidbit of like historical lore or I mean fact, but who knows if it really well, like things are passed down by, orally through the years. So like, who knows like how accurate it is. But it is from Christopher Columbus himself.
Stand up
So
guy.
he's a stand-up guy. Oh my God.
As we know, he's the
Uh,
most reliable witness, of
yeah,
course.
yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Like, we don't know how accurate it is, and it's been passed down through many, many years. But it is something interesting that basically he reported seeing a UFO before anyone says anything. Well, it's a podcast, you're not going to say anything, but still, before you stop me and say like, well, a UFO is like a modern thing. UFO just stands for unidentified flying object, because that's what I thought first. I was like, what do you mean Christopher Columbus saw a UFO? And like, it doesn't make any sense to me. But then I realized like UFO is just unidentified flying object. So anything that's flying and you don't know what it is a UFO. So he saw a UFO while sailing through the Bermuda Triangle, and he said that it looked like the light of a candle moving up and down. And one person on the ship said, "Oh, well, it must be land. Like we must be getting close to land then, because that looks like, why would there be a light in the middle of the ocean?" And someone else who knew the waters well and was actually like, I don't know if it was a captain or who, but like they knew where they were. They're like, "We're nowhere near land. That is not land." And so I guess it was like backed up by a few people that they saw this light. And we kind of talked about this too, that like we were like, oh, the light of a candle, that's interesting. But when
Mm-hmm.
you think about it, the only light they knew back then in 1492, I think it was, the
I'm
only light
really
they had
bad at history.
ever, yeah, it was something ending in two, because it reminded
Yeah,
the
19
he
1492 probably, yeah, like you mentioned.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they didn't really have technology or electricity back then. So yeah, like a candle is pretty much all they've got to compare it to. But it's interesting because I mean, you do have to think about it, like where did this light come from? I mean, it is possible that he maybe saw a ship in the distance and got confused and thought that he saw something flying, but I mean, it's just interesting to think about because again, like they were nowhere near land. Because my original thought was, oh, maybe like a lighthouse or some type of building that emits light. But again, like I don't know if they had a building or if they had strong enough light to, you know, bounce that off like a ship. So who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just a lot of things to take into consideration. If anything from this story, I think the interesting conversation we had is about what we were just talking about, that back then the only light they could really compare it to was that of a candle or like the sun, obviously, but that's a very different light. But like nowadays, we could say like if we see a light in the distance, we could say, oh, that looks like a flashlight, or that looks like a phone, or that looks like, you know, a TV, or that looks like so many different types of lights. But it's funny to think because like I had this realization when I was reading this. I was like, oh, they said a light of a candle. Oh wait, that was the only light that existed back then. Was like, you know, some kind of flame.
Right, like the light bulb hadn't been invented yet.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. So yeah, that's just something we thought we would mention. But obviously, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of credence to this theory. There's not a lot of things backing it up. But we just thought it was something weird that that Christopher Columbus of all people, you know what I mean? He wasn't just like a random sailor. It was
like he's a well-known figure.
Yeah, exactly. Not for we don't stand him. We don't like him, but he is, you know, for better or for worse,
he's a figure, yeah.
Exactly. So we thought we'd mention that. And for our last theory, or well, we have two more, but my personal favorite theory, Atlantis, of course. So when I first thought about this, I was like, okay, yeah, like of course Atlantis is a theory. And then I started thinking more and I was like, wait, but what's the theory?
Yeah.
Because Atlantis is just it's just a theory that pertains to the ocean, but it wouldn't explain anything necessarily. But I guess the theory is that like, so I kind of looked into like Atlantis and Bermuda Triangle, like to see if there's any kind of connections like with theories and whatnot. And so there is a theory that Atlantis was once another continent. So instead of just the continents we have now, we had an additional continent of Atlantis, and it sank into the Bermuda Triangle. And so it's cursed, I guess. I don't know. I guess that's kind of like the theory.
So is the theory like that, like Atlantis is like affecting the Bermuda Triangle, or that like, the Bermuda Triangle pulls things down, maybe because it pulled Atlantis down?
It could go either way. It definitely could go either way. That like it was an ancient thing that before, like let's just say Atlantis was a continent, right? The theory could be that there's something mythical or something happening in that water that sunk things into it, including the entire continent of Atlantis. That's one theory. Another theory is that like the water was fine, but then for some reason they sank into the Atlantic, and then because they're down there, it's almost like an aquatic Indian burial ground where it's like cursed. You see what I'm saying? Like and obviously this is just wacky stuff.
Right.
But the reason I loved this one so much was because it reminded me of Jar Jar Binks' home city. If you guys, like, if we have any Star Wars fans, you'll know that I can't remember which episode it was. I think was it episode 1? I don't know. But in one of the episodes of Star Wars, like one of the prequels, Jar Jar Binks goes down to his home city with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, and they have to swim there because it's in Naboo. Naboo is the planet, but it's in the sea, and so they swim to it, and it's this like big, basically a big bubble that you like swim into. It's like a force field. I think it's called Auto Gunga because they're Gungans. So I just a nerd like that. I just thought I would mention that like I love this idea of Atlantis because like that's always been my conception of Atlantis is Jar Jar Binks' home, because I just love Star Wars. So yeah, I just thought I would mention that like that's my personal favorite theory, even though it literally makes no sense at all and there's like basically no theory there. It's my favorite just because it reminds me of Atlantis and of Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I don't know how much I believe it, but it's definitely something to think about.
Same, yeah.
So now we get to my favorite theory, and I don't know, I feel like when I was a kid, like I said, I first heard about the Bermuda Triangle when I had to do a project in 3rd grade, and, you know, I was pretty young back then. I wasn't that smart. But so my personal, like, favorite theory, or what I guess I really wanted to believe, is that it was a portal to, like, another dimension or something. Like, so maybe ships and planes kind of just, like, flew into this, like, portal and got transported to, like, I don't know, like an alternate dimension or whatever. And it's like, I don't know why I was so fascinated by it. Maybe it's because, like something supernatural and it's more exciting. And also, like, I guess it's a happier ending rather than, oh, the ships and the planes just sank or crash and all those people are dead. I guess it's something like, oh, what if they're alive, somewhere else?
Yeah, that definitely is hard as a kid to learn about death and to learn about like you did this whole project on like the Bermuda Triangle and like literally it's just a huge plot of death in the ocean,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that it's definitely a happier ending. Like you said, it's just like an easier way to think of it. I think that's so cute that as a kid you're like, oh, they just went to a different dimension. No one's dead. People don't die. It's totally fine. Like, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I get, like I said, I guess it's like, it appeals to me because it's like an alternate answer, and while it's not based in scientific fact, I mean, we can pretend, we can all, imagine, and but yeah, I mean, again, we don't have the answers to the Bermuda Triangle. Obviously, like it has been a mystery for quite a while, and maybe someday we'll find the answers. I would really love to find the answers, but like I said, what you believe or what you think is totally up to you. Like what you decide on the Bermuda Triangle. But anyway, that is the end of this episode, and we hope you really enjoyed it. We'll see you next week with another episode, and if you want to reach out to us, definitely reach out to us on our Instagram at Dark Matter Pod and our Facebook Dark Matter Podcast. And if you want to look up any of our sources on this episode, definitely check out our website, darkmatterpod.com. And good news, guys, we officially have a Twitter now. It is darkmatter_pod. So go follow us on Twitter if you want to stay updated on news for upcoming episodes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and if you like this episode, definitely give us a review on Apple Podcasts. And you can listen to us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel, which is just Dark Matter Podcast. And if you did enjoy this episode or any of the other episodes, be sure to spread the word to your friends and fam. All right, thanks for listening, guys.
Bye.